Well, I think it's 3 o'clock. It looks like we have all of our panelists here. Mayor London Breed, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to welcome all of the people who are joining us for the San Francisco Housing Action Coalition's Spring Symposium. When we were thinking about planning this 3 months ago, we had no idea what, the world was going to look like. And so, it's pretty exciting and interesting to kind of do this first one online. Mayor Breed, I want to thank you so much for joining us. You come to our events from time to time, and it's great having you. Really want to thank you for your leadership that you've shown, throughout your career in housing. And I was kind of thinking about today, from the time that you were the executive director of the African American Cultural Center to when you were the District 5 supervisor to being the mayor, you have really led the city on housing and the need for housing at all levels of affordability. So just wanted to thank you on that. You've been a consistent supporter of that. And what an amazing job you've done leading the city through just these unprecedented and difficult times. And so, as a resident of the city and just as an organization, one of the urbanist organizations, we really just want to say thank you. And, anything that we can do to be helpful, in kind of as we're opening the city back up safely, we want to be there and be a working partner with you. So, Mayor Breed, we'd love to hear, everyone in the audience would love to hear kind of your thoughts as to kind of what you see as kind of the future of San Francisco and urbanism. I know that there was just an announcement. We were kind of, before you got on with the presenters were discussing a little bit about, wow, what a kind of interesting time that maybe we're going to start seeing, right, tables and chairs, right, on our sidewalks and streets. And like there's, a certain kind of excitement of urbanism, even though it's coming from like a difficult situation. So, we really are looking forward to hearing your words and your vision of what maybe the next 6 months is going to look like in San Francisco. So I'm going to mute myself and turn this over to you.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Todd, and thank you for your efforts in leading to produce housing in the city. We know that it's not just about San Francisco and our ability to produce housing, it's about the entire region and what we see playing itself out, not just during this pandemic around homelessness, but just what's happening throughout the entire state. We see that homelessness has unfortunately gotten worse. And I think that it has a direct impact on how we are able to produce housing for all of us and the affordability of housing, which is something that many of us are fighting for, are struggling for. And so I know this is really going to be a very great conversation with Rich Hillis, who's the Director of Planning, as well as Jeff Tumlin with the Director of MTA here in city. Transportation and housing go hand in hand, and the ability to produce more housing at transit corridors, I know, is something that's important to you. And also, I'm glad we have a champion in Sacramento and Scott Wiener, who has really led this cause for so long. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be here, and I know that this virus has really changed things for all of us and really disrupted our quality of life. It's dramatically changed our economy. It's altered our city budget significantly and our ability to deliver services in the way that I know we deserve. And we are going through a really tough time right now in the city, but I really want to talk today about building more housing and how important it is now more than ever. I know when the health directive first came around, one of the pushes that I made was that we continue construction around all housing. And that was a battle, but we're back there to a point where construction is resumed, not just with housing, but with everything, because we know that after this is over, it's going to be needed more than ever. We also know there's been a narrative out there about how density is a problem in the new era of COVID-19, and this anti-density narrative feeds off people's fear about catching the virus. And but let's get some of the facts straight. San Francisco is the second most dense city in America, and yet we have seen early success in our efforts to combat and prevent the spread. And this is really a testament to all of you and to all the residents of San Francisco. No, we don't have 100% compliance, but the fact is most of our residents are stepping up. We're resilient, we are prepared. And this issue isn't about density, it's about overcrowding. And we understand that it may be easier for the coronavirus to spread in congregate living settings, which is why we worked early on to make sure that places like SROs and our shelters and others were prioritized. Our ability to flatten the curve is a product of our early action, and it has nothing to do with density. But we have to acknowledge that the shelter in place has pushed us really to a new normal. And many of the development projects were halted due to our temporary health orders. And while that is painful for many of you who had projects being constructed, we had to prioritize public safety over building housing temporarily. And the good news is we're back. Now that all construction has resumed with the proper protocols around sanitation and social distancing, we have to think about those who do not have housing or shelter to stay home, for whom the new normal is practically impossible. We already know that housing is important for a person's health and safety, and this pandemic has exacerbated that. But because we have been underbuilding housing for so long, we are seeing disproportionate impacts in our low-income communities and those experiencing unsheltered homelessness. We have taken steps to prevent people from losing their homes, issuing a moratorium on residential evictions, increasing access to food security programs so people don't have to choose between paying rent and putting food on the table. We've allowed construction to continue with safety protocols in place for construction workers. And I created the Economic Recovery Task Force with Board President Norman Yee, led by Assessor Recorder Carmen Chu, our Treasurer Jose Cisneros, the Director of the Chamber of Commerce, Rodney Fong, and the Director of the San Francisco Labor Council, Rudy Gonzalez, to help lead us in the recovery. But this is going to require long-term solutions because this coronavirus is going to impact us far beyond when the shelter in place is lifted. While we do need to prioritize new economic and workforce development opportunities to help the thousands of people who've lost their jobs and are filing for unemployment, over 100,000 in San Francisco, we still need to prioritize housing, especially affordable housing. And this is why I'm excited that the Planning Commission last week approved the hub, which will generate 9,700 new units with over 2,200 affordable units. We need to maintain the plan, not reduce heights, and with it, our affordability totals. I also am excited to hopefully see the Planning Commission support the Balboa Reservoir, which is 1,100 new units with 50% for affordable and a great new neighborhood amenities such as 4 acres of open space. It's really, really exciting. This is the future of urbanism in San Francisco. Right here, more housing, more affordable housing, more public open space that everyone can enjoy. And I look forward to cutting the red tape and making it easier. And just yesterday, we made an announcement that allows restaurants to use the sidewalks for their restaurants so that people can eat outside, so that we're able to provide more space. But we're allowing restaurants to do this without charging them. I mean, who would have thought? And the fact that you can apply for a permit and we will work with you and make it easy for you to try and conduct business in this way is, I think, something that could be great for our city and great for the future. When I think about during the Central Subway and the construction that was going on and the downtown area and how great it was to have, you know, the plaza closed out, how many people we saw shopping downtown and were hanging out with their families and eating at some of the food trucks and enjoying the city. When I think about Sunday streets and even what we're doing right now in terms of our Safe Streets project, people are not only enjoying their neighborhoods, they're getting to know their neighbors. It's making us a better, more stronger community. When I think about how we have come together during this crisis and we've been able to really not only see how important our public spaces are, but how connected we all are to one another. The need to just re-envision what San Francisco should look like as it relates to moving not just vehicles and buses around, but how do we move people around more efficiently? How do we make sure that we're able to balance the needs for our economy, for housing opportunities, getting people back and forth to work, getting them to their appointments, but also giving people an opportunity to enjoy the beauty of the city. That's what's happening right now. So I know that there is a lot of frustration when you see so many people all over the parks and at the beaches and other places, but right now, those are the places that people have to go to enjoy the city. We can't go to a restaurant. We can't go to a museum right now. So there's a lot of changes that we are going to need to make, because I think it will make for a more enjoyable city as a whole. But it all roads lead to housing. I say that time and time again. If you don't have a safe, affordable place to call home, no matter what your income is, then that creates a whole nother set of problems. Because as I said early on, even though most people are complying with the order, when you look at places like the Tenderloin and our homeless population of people who sadly, in some instances, suffer from mental illness and substance use disorder, they are not complying in many instances, which creates a whole nother problem for all of us, because we're all connected. So at the end of the day, we have got to move more aggressive now, especially with the economic challenges that we know we face. We cannot put housing at the back burner. We have to look at new policies. We have to look at new ways to move forward the housing that we desperately need, not just for the people who are struggling to live here, but also for the new, hopefully, job opportunities and other things that we're looking forward to do in the future in order to bring our economy back. So it's a lot to do, a little time to do it. We have been derailed, but not denied. So let's keep that in mind as we continue our fight and our push to prepare a better city for the future. You all are going to play an important role in doing that. So thank you all so much for the opportunity and enjoy your panel.
Mayor, thank you so much for those words. We really appreciate you joining us. Please let us know if there's anything that we as a community can do to be helpful, to achieve your vision of, housing for everyone at all levels of affordability. And, we are really interested to see, and we're really very optimistic about the future of San Francisco. So again, thank you so much.
Thanks, Todd. Take care.
Okay, bye. So I'm going to ask the other panelists to come on back and join us. So, all right, great. So it was great. We had an introduction from the mayor, heard her, her leadership's been phenomenal. So I'm just going to do a little official welcome to everybody, kind of set maybe a couple of themes. And I'm going to turn this over to Christy to go on. So, some of the things that we at the Housing Action Coalition have really been thinking about, over the, since the beginning of kind of the shelter in place of the pandemic, right? What does it mean to shelter in place, right, if you don't have a home, right? And we often think about, and we often talk about as an organization, as a staff, as that the problems that we are seeing right now really come to a pre-existing COVID. It's just that the inequities, the pandemic, the shelter in place has just really magnified and really put a spotlight on these inequities that have been there, that have been in the housing world. And, and so what do we do? And what we also like to be thinking about all the time, what are things that maybe 100 days ago were aspirational, that maybe today, because people are really seeing these inequities every day, are now accomplishable, right? What are the policies that, that maybe urbanists have always been like, yeah, here are the things that we should be doing, but perhaps the politicians have said like, that might be a little bit too far. So what are those things that perhaps we can, get accomplished that we weren't able to do 100 days ago? So very excited to hear from the three of you. I can really think of no better three people to be holding this conversation. All of you are really experts on urbanism and housing and transit. And so, I want to thank the three of you for coming. So I also need to just take care of a little bit of Housing Action Coalition business. We just want to recognize a handful of our platinum sponsors. Obviously, fundraising for nonprofits has to continue during these trying times. And I know that for the Housing Action Coalition, we have amazing members, and I'm sure like Spur is just really, really thankful for the loyalty and the support of our membership. And I know that a lot of the memberships of the organization have overlap. So our platinum sponsors, in no particular order, Facebook, and it's really exciting to have organizations, large employers like Facebook, become members of the Housing Action Coalition. They have seen the need for housing for their employees and the need for housing for the cities that they work in and the urban centers that they work in. So thank you, Facebook. One Vassar, thank you. Sharon Lai and team have been amazing supporters of the Housing Action Coalition. Really phenomenal project in Central Soma, one that we have looked at for a long time. Related California, Bill Whitty and Ann Silverberg, just two of the really great developers who make my job so easy. They do their projects the right way, involving the community, doing a high level of community benefits, and it's really amazing. TMG, another longtime sponsor and supporter of the Housing Action Coalition, Michael Covarrubias and Nice Pinkston have really been serving the community really amazingly by their work on the 3P Coalition and the work that they're doing in Sacramento to really make sure that housing production at all levels of affordability can move forward. The team at Mission Rock, really exciting project, 40% permanently affordable projects. It's great to have the Giants and Tishman Speyer collaborating on that project. Bridge Housing, another longtime member of the Housing Action Coalition, build amazing 100% affordable housing projects. They're great partners. Another amazing organization, Park Merced, adding significant amount of much needed housing on the west side of the city. Great partners. And certainly last but not least, Suffolk Construction, which really was one of the organizations that took the lead to make sure that safety on the construction site was top of mind and really made sure that the workers were able to build housing in a really safe manner. So I just want to thank all those organizations that is going forward. And so now I am going to turn it over to Christy Wong from Spur. Spur, for those who don't know, the Housing Action Coalition spun out of Spur 20-some years ago, and they continue to be, if not our top key partner, certainly one of the top 2 or 3 key partners with the Housing Action Coalition. Amazing policy think tank. So Christy Wong is Spur's Community Planning Policy Director, the author of several reports on housing and land use issues in San Jose. She also leads Spur's work in community planning and housing in San Francisco. Christy is currently the vice president of the Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation's board of directors. Christy also teaches courses on urban development and affordable housing at Stanford University, go Cardinal, and San Francisco State University. Prior to joining Spur, Christy was a project manager at Bridge Housing Corporation, one of the West Coast's largest affordable housing developers. So Christy, take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Todd. It's really a pleasure to join you for this event. The Housing Coalition is a great partner to Spur, and I'm excited to be a part of this particular conversation at this particularly crazy moment in time with these particular people. And so thanks to everyone who's tuned in. And I want to share a little bit about our 2 illustrious guests. Rich Hillis is the planning director for the City and County of San Francisco, where he's responsible for overseeing long-range city planning, development review, and environmental review of most physical development in San Francisco. He served on the San Francisco Planning Commission for 8 years before becoming director of the planning department earlier this year. Prior to joining San Francisco Planning, Rich served as the executive director for the Fort Mason Center for Arts and Culture, where he led its reinvigoration, investing over $60 million into the historic campus and providing a stable and vibrant home to dozens of arts organizations and events. Before joining the Fort Mason Center, Rich served as deputy director of San Francisco's Office of Economic and Workforce Development, where he managed all aspects of the redevelopment of Treasure Island and Yerba Buena Island into a new 8,000 unit mixed-use neighborhood, led effort priority port development projects, and oversaw efforts to develop and implement a comprehensive strategy for development along Octavia Boulevard. Previously, he was a San Francisco Rec and Park Director of Partnerships and Property, managing RPD's assets and concessions. And I will introduce Jeff Tumlin, Director of Transportation at San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency, San Francisco's agency responsible for the management of all ground transportation in the city of San Francisco. Jeff oversees Muni, public transit, bicycling, paratransit, parking, traffic, walking, and taxis. Jeff is the former director of strategy at Nelson Nygaard Consulting Associates, a San Francisco-based transportation planning and engineering firm that focuses on sustainable mobility. Previously, he also served as interim director of the new Oakland Department of Transportation. For more than 20 years, he has led station area, downtown, citywide, and campus plans and delivered various lectures and classes in 20 US states and 5 countries. His major development projects have succeeded in reducing traffic and CO2 emissions by as much as 40% and accommodated many millions of square feet of growth with no net increase in motor vehicle traffic. These projects have won awards from the U.S. General Services Administration, Institute of Transportation Engineers, American Planning Association, American Society of Landscape Architects, Congress for the New Urbanism, and the Urban Land Institute. Last but not least, Jeff is the author of a book, Sustainable Transportation, Tools for Creating Healthy, Vibrant, and Resilient Communities. So between these two people, we can get a lot of insight into where the city is and may be headed, particularly at this critical juncture. So let's jump in. The COVID-19 crisis has certainly thrown a spotlight on density and urbanism, as the mayor just mentioned, and has raised a lot of questions about choices people may make in the future about where they live and how they move about. So I wanted to see how would each of you describe the concept of urbanism generally? What makes you an urbanist, and what are the values that you associate with urbanism? Jeff, you can go first.
Rich is our chief urbanist.
Rich, would you like to go first?
Sure. I mean, so, you know, it's interesting. Kind of, I was thinking about this definition of what is urbanism and what's the value of urbanism. And I sometimes George W. Bush this phrase, but it's a notion that you know, the city is made up of many parts. But to me, and I think many of us who kind of are urbanists, is the whole of the city is greater than the sum of its parts. You know, there's a value for us to mixing up people in ideas in the city. We solve problems better, we're more creative, we're more productive. There's just an intrinsic value of being together, which I think is why this crisis has kind of caused people to scratch their heads and kind of figure out what that means for urbanism, because we can't mix like we once did.
Jeff, what would you like to add to that?
I obviously agree. I think urbanism, it's a combination of concentration and human scale that allows for an intensity of creativity that is not possible without those two elements, that in turn results in economic opportunity. It's also a platform for weirdos and misfits who don't otherwise fit in elsewhere, who can come to urbanism to actually contribute and to create change, to invent new culture. Cities and urbanism is where culture gets created.
I love all the things that you just said. And I guess I'm curious, the idea of concentration and human scale together, are there cities around the world that you would point to as doing a job at both of those things?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and it happens at every imaginable scale. Like you can have urbanism in a, you know, in a medieval French or Italian hill town that is really quite small. Small in area, but has sufficient concentration that it sparks that urban magic. You can also have places of extraordinary density that I would argue are not urban. There are parts of sort of Brezhnev era fringe of Moscow has density, but the urbanism of Moscow's utterly delightful core falls apart at the edge. So it's that balance, that tension between those two factors that I think is critical.
For both of you, have your views of urbanism changed since the COVID-19 outbreak? And what you think is important? Or has it challenged anything for you?
I think fundamentally, no. I mean, I think, holding on to those values, I think is still critical. And I think urbanism will survive, even though we're hearing, you can Google cities and, how they're responding to this crisis, and you'll get every type of article from it's the end of cities as we know it, to kind of, this is our opportunity to kind of to renew our commitment to urban spaces. But I don't think so. I mean, I think there's some challenges, how we, or some tweaks in how we use public space, the future of retail. Is office going to be kind of changed in how it's used? But I think at its core, no, urbanism, is here to stay and will survive.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think that that COVID has, so we're tribal social primates and we crave conviviality, right? At a biological level. We find nothing more fascinating than other humans. And COVID has resulted in a kind of pervasive fear that is disrupting conviviality. But that is a constant. We will continue to crave that. It is a biological constant that is unchanging. So this is a moment where cities have to get creative once again. We're going to be entering a period of intense creativity and change to reinvent how we meet our emotional needs as humans and get emotional support from each other and feel like our lives are meaningful and full of opportunity. That's one of the things that we're struggling with at Muni is like we're facing the exact same problem that restaurants are facing. Restaurants thrive by bringing people together, right? Their restaurants are not delivering food. That's not their business. Restaurants deliver conviviality. Muni doesn't just deliver mobility. Like we deliver part of the experience of San Francisco. One learns how to become a San Franciscan riding Muni. It's the only place that brings everyone together and reminds us of what we have in common.
So what would you say to those who are worried about the future of high density and public transit usage?
I would say look at every single East Asian capital, particularly the East Asian democracies, who have figured out how to have thriving urban life while eliminating transmission of this virus. They are doing things because they actually have a national health policy in Korea and in Taiwan. We unfortunately do not, and we can't have pandemic policy be rooted at the municipal level. It's got to be at a much larger level, and we need to be capable of making tough choices.
Yeah. And I think it's important to look historically about how cities have prevailed. We've been through pandemics before. We've been through shifts in flight to the suburbs. We've been through natural disasters, terrorist attacks, a big shift in technology that was going to kind of seismically shift how we live together and use offices. But cities have survived and I think become stronger as a result of this.
Because they're full of creative weirdos.
Do you have any responses for those who repeat the rhetoric about higher infection, blaming higher infection rates on density? Is there a message you want people to carry?
Yeah, I mean, the data is really clear. There's no relationship between density and COVID transmission. There is a relationship between crowding and COVID transmission, but density and crowding are very much not the same thing. In fact, in many respects, density can be the solution to overcrowding. And again, we only need look at any East Asian city that is far denser, like an order of magnitude denser than a city like San Francisco. And their COVID transmission rates are far lower. Their deaths are far lower in cities that are an order of magnitude larger than San Francisco. So this is not a hard problem to solve. And retreating in a fear-based way to the isolation of suburban sprawl and driving in cars, that's just delusion, right? That is the marketing of the sprawl industry and the automobile industry, as they've tried to do for the last 70 years, right? This is just the last ditch effort of the sprawl industry to foster the delusion that isolation equals safety, when the data is clear that the opposite is true. Even in New York, the highest transmission rates have been in the suburbs.
Yeah, so I guess if overcrowding is one of the challenges, that certainly highlights that it's yet again, it's an equity issue, that the people who are being impacted the most are people who don't have other options.
That's right, and who, because of a housing shortage, are cramming a lot of people into a small space, right? Adding additional density alleviates crowding.
So I think, as Todd had referenced earlier, the pandemic has interrupted many things about how we operate in the world and cities and otherwise, and gives us a chance to think about how to do things differently, maybe do them better, do them more equitably, more efficiently. What would you like to see done differently? I think, the shared spaces idea and slow streets is one thing that's come up. What are some things that are top of mind for you about what you might want to change in the coming way that we operate in the world?
Well, I think just to follow up on that point, with the need for additional housing, I mean, clearly this has highlighted the need for housing at all levels, but very much so at the lower income levels in housing for homeless individuals. Clearly a need. So I think we need to take this opportunity, one, to fund that need, which has constantly been an issue, the need for additional affordable housing. I mean, I worked on the Octavia Boulevard project 12 years ago, where we transferred land to the redevelopment agency that's just now coming online as affordable housing. And it's because it's not because there wasn't a demand for that housing, but there just wasn't the funding for it. And then also just our process around building housing. And we see the state responding to this already, is kind of allowing us to move forward where we're zoned for housing, allowing us to build that housing and not go through a tremendous amount of process to get there.
I do want to come back to this housing question. I've wanted to hear your take on.
So we've got a very narrow window of time in the transportation world. So if you all are on your laptops, go to Google Maps right now at 3:34 p.m. And look at the traffic pattern in Google Maps. Now in late May, with 10% of the economy reopened. Yesterday marked the first day of the recurrence of deep commute-related traffic congestion on the regional highway system. Today it is even worse. We have until probably mid-July at the latest to try to forestall a crushing level of traffic congestion far beyond what this region has ever seen. So even just a small amount of mode shift away from transit to driving, which is understandable because of the perceived safety of driving. It takes up at least 10 times as much space per person to move somebody in a car than it does in a bus, and over 100 times as much space to move somebody in a car than in BART. A relatively small shift to driving will result in a complete lockdown of mobility throughout the region, which quickly becomes the primary limit on further economic opening for the region. We can't afford this. And so we've got a very narrow window to protect transit from recurring crippling traffic congestion. We have a very narrow window of time to create a network of streets that will allow normal people beyond just like 28-year-old white guys in Lycra to be able to take a scooter or their bike or their skateboard or whatever to their job. So we have the advantage that like in the last, 5 weeks, we'll have nearly completed 35 miles of slow streets, something that would have under normal circumstances taken us, 7 years to do because of the ridiculous regulatory constraints that have been swept away in the emergency. Government can get shit done if all the pointless bureaucracy and red tape that is put there in place to stop change and to preserve the privileges of the status quo. That's what most of the regulations are that we face are designed to do, to slow us down and to make us inefficient. But if those regulations are removed and if government is very clear about its values and the desired outcome, government is capable of solving real problems and forestalling catastrophe, which is coming in 2 months. So, so we're prepared to move really quickly. We'll be asking over the next 4 weeks some really big questions of policymakers throughout the city about how serious do we want to be about having our economy survive the economic fallout of the virus and set San Francisco up to be far more resilient and sustainable into the future. I'm looking forward to that conversation. I hope many of you will join us.
What do you, I think you're right that a lot of that is the city being bold and taking those steps. I think that a lot of people in their everyday lives are looking for some guidance about what they themselves ought to do at the personal level to make the right choices. So what would be your message to the rest of us?
So if on a mobility side in the short term, there's never been a better time to learn how to ride a bike safely in San Francisco. And bikes and scooters and skateboards and other funny little wheel devices have most of the same geometric efficiency as public transit does. So if you're concerned about taking transit, now's the time to look at walking and biking and skateboarding. And the San Francisco Bike Coalition and others have safe riding skills classes. All of the slow streets that are out there that we've built so far, particularly Sanchez and Lake and the Great Highway and Kirkham and Shotwell and Page. Hundreds of children are out there every day learning to bike safely. Join those children and figure out that San Francisco, that there's always a way around every single hill. And if you live on the top of a steep hill, now's the time to invest not in a car, but in an e-bike. I live on top of a 300-foot high hill, gave up my car months ago, and so glad that I did. E-bike makes it so much easier to get access to the city that I love.
One more question on this thread, which is that when we talked before, you mentioned that Muni buses were moving faster than they ever have or in some long period of time. Can you share that? And is that already deteriorating as of this week?
So we found one thing at SFMTA, we have great data. We don't necessarily use that data as well as we could, but we've been observing that our buses on key corridors are enjoying, on average, about a 20% improvement in travel speed, and in some key corridors, a 50% improvement in travel speed, as a result of the complete lack of congestion over the last couple of weeks. We've also, because we retreated into a position of radical resiliency, given the erratic availability of our operators, because of our deep focus on protecting our worker health. We not only needed to strip back the number of lines we were offering, but we had to abandon schedules. We couldn't operate on schedules. So we switched entirely to headway management, which means all we're asking our operators to do is to space themselves out evenly between the bus in front of them and the bus behind them. And what we've realized is that our passengers don't care whether the schedule says the bus comes every 9 minutes or every 12 minutes. What the passengers care about is that two buses don't show up at the same time, followed by a 20-minute gap. So weirdly, Muni service is more reliable potentially than it has ever been in history. Because of this combination of a lack of congestion and managing for even spacing rather than schedule. So we are hoping to find a path that allows us to hold on to both of those dramatic improvements. And you know, as I've been explaining to the board of supervisors in the sort of conversation that we're having about should Muni increase its fares to match its rising costs, the financial value of the travel time and reliability savings that we've had in COVID is far greater than anything that we would get out of a fare increase. So how can we hold on to that savings? Oh, and another thing we found is everywhere that we have transit priority treatments, you know, on Mission Street, on 4th Street, no improvement in speed or reliability in COVID. Only the places where buses are sharing the road with a lot of cars. That's where we're seeing the improvement.
That is fascinating. Going back to the original question of what we might be able to change in our operations going forward, I've had a lot of questions about how planning and community engagement might change as we move forward. I think there's a lot of there's a lot of cynicism about the existing state of affairs. I held an event at SPUR a few months ago, thinking about, re-envisioning the planning commission. How would you change sort of the practice of planning really in a lot of ways? And I've heard that the mix of people calling into public comment at planning may be expressing a wider range of views than used to be shared at public comment. So I'm curious if that sounds accurate to you, and how you think that will we stick with this? Will we go to some sort of mix of ways of taking public comment? And then, going a step further, maybe both of you could talk a little bit about community engagement for some of the big projects. So if you're doing this virtually for Balboa Reservoir and the Potrero Bus Yard, what are you learning from that experience? Rich?
Yeah, so definitely there hasn't been a reduction in the amount of community input we get during hearings, in probably a bit of an uptick on some of the items. I think people are still getting used to how to do it and trying to figure it out, but I think there is an ability to capture a wider audience in wider public comment. And we're seeing it both at our commission meetings. I mean, I participated in a Potrero Boosters meeting last night through Zoom, which was easy to do and kind of get out to the neighborhood kind of remotely, which worked nicely. We're seeing that happening at Balboa as part of their CAC. So hopefully it does start to kind of catch on and widen the voices we're hearing from. I think there's still no kind of replacement to going out to neighborhoods and talking to people where they live and kind of talking about, one, our need for housing, the impacts that a project may have to a neighborhood, the benefits that a project may have to a neighborhood. So that will still be, I think, a core part of our work that's not going to be replaced, but I think we can make our commission meetings more effective and hear from a wider range of San Franciscans on issues through doing them kind of remotely. And I think that'll continue beyond this. Hopefully the technology gets a little better. People are able to kind of show drawings and maybe even themselves in these hearings, but it's worked. And we've had 6 hearings now and hope to do more.
Jeff, did you
at the SFMTA, we're seeing a similar phenomenon. The conventional San Francisco engagement process is deeply broken. It privileges the most privileged, and the people who show up tend to be the angriest or the most to financially benefit or disbenefit. It's very frustrating to me. And so in addition to opening up our formal sort of board process to a broader audience, including, interestingly, at SFMTA, at our board, people with very limited access to technology. We've been surprised at the number of people who've used a standard telephone to dial in and listen in, who don't even have access to a computer, and who offered actually some really interesting perspective. But for us, more importantly, we're completely changing our engagement on projects. So I think the Slow Streets process has demonstrated that you can get a lot more effective engagement by going out, using really simple changeable materials and literally experimenting in the street, saying, because people can't understand what we're talking about. No one knows how to read plan drawings. But if you go out and actually try stuff out in the street and then get comments and then make adjustments and get comments again and make more adjustments, that engagement is much more substantive, more cost effective, involves a lot more people, and then allows us to get the design right, so that when we go for funding and go to implement final design, there is deep buy-in already. Because otherwise, we do a whole bunch of community meetings and then come back a year later to go do the project, and everyone has forgotten, and there's been turnover, and only the angry people come out. So we're wanting to do a lot more of what we call quick build, and in some ways super quick build, where we just try stuff and make adjustments until we get it right.
So on the flip side, so not looking at opportunities, but looking at limitations, what are some of the limitations? I think the obvious one is money, that we'll face as a result of the pandemic. So curious about your priorities, your approach to thinking about it, or other limitations that I'm not thinking of that rise to the top, like money.
Well, money is top of mind for us. I started this job with a $50 million annual structural deficit at SFMTA. I now have a $250 million quarterly deficit, and we don't know when our main sources of revenue are coming back. So things are really bad. My focus right now is in avoiding massive layoffs, and if we succeed at that, we'll probably be the only transportation agency in the country that does. Things are really, really, really bad. So we have that limitation. We also have the limitation that right now, like the health directive gives us a lot of freedom to do things that are specifically COVID and COVID recovery related. And all decision-making goes through the city's emergency operations center. So we're limited to that lane. Like there's a lot more that we could do, but it's not health related or recovery related. So like that can't be a priority. It's also, we can't suspend any of the usual rules if it's not specifically related to the health order.
In this, same issue, our fee revenue is down $6 million from kind of a budget of $41 million, so over a 10% hit in this kind of current fiscal year. Where that'll go, I think, is a question. Will things rebound slowly? Will they rebound quickly? Who knows? But I think we've got to kind of get out of this cycle of not doing much during a downturn and pouring things on during good times and try to stabilize things like fees. I mean, we tend to get ourselves in this cycle where we want to push to reduce fees during a downturn and stimulate the economy, but then kind of max out on them when we're in good times. And I think we spend a lot of time kind of going back and forth on those issues. We should use this opportunity to come up with kind of a stable methodology for things like inclusionary housing, for things like our fees, and find frankly stable revenue sources for things like affordable housing. I think we rely too much on development to fund our affordable housing obligations. We need to kind of broaden that so that we do have a regular source of funding that's available during downturns.
Yeah, I think that was a question that I had, which is, that a lot of the specifically for affordable housing, but I think for a lot of other benefits, is tied to the economy in some way, whether it's tied to market rate housing development, whether it's tied to office development, whether it's tied to the voters' interest in funding bonds and other revenue sources. So, do you have any thoughts on how to stabilize that kind of funding for priorities in a sort of sustainable and equitable way over the long run?
Well, it's particularly, I mean, if you link it to development, whether it's office development or housing development, I mean, one, it kind of, there's a disincentive to develop housing. But I think the bigger issue is it's just not a regular source of funding. It's like tying something to the transfer tax. I mean, there's other sources of funding that, all these sources are going to go up and down during an economic, growth in recession. But some, like property tax, do less of that. I like bonds because they are tied to property tax. But again, we tend to do them when we're defeasing other bonds, so we're not increasing property taxes overall. But I think if we've got this serious commitment to fund affordable housing, we've got to find sources of funding that are more regular and not just tied to housing. Again, most of us live in homes that were built 50, 100 years ago. They're not necessarily paying into affordable housing, yet a new development could be paying impact fees during construction, and then also additional property taxes from CFDs after construction. So I think we've got to spread that out, whether it's state sources or federal sources or local sources, to fund our affordable housing obligations.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same on the transportation side. And I mean, it's the same in every municipal government agency in California. Municipal government finance is fundamentally broken in California. Government expenditures are driven by labor. And so our expenses tend to increase with cost of living because we have to pay our workforce a living wage in order to afford to live in an economy where the cost of housing is rapidly increasing, far greater than the rate of inflation. And yet our revenues increase at best at inflation. And most of our key sources of revenue, including property tax, increases at a rate less than inflation. So in a boom economy, our structural deficit at SFMTA widened because our expenses were increasing faster than our net revenue because of built-in structural inequities like Prop 13. So this is a fundamental problem, and unless we can have consistent revenue that rises with expenses, Muni will always face dire reliability problems. We will continue to defer maintenance because that's an easy short-term thing to do, to push the problem off to 5 years from now when things start falling apart. We will defer things like hiring or line supervision because we want to fund operators. Who the hell cares if we have anyone to actually manage the operators? The reason why Muni has problems is because of the fundamental structural deficit where my predecessors made a reasonable decision to disinvest in something and pay for it later. And it's a pattern. So one of the things that we are most interested in is looking seriously at decongestion pricing. So the SFCTA decongestion pricing study for the downtown is continuing to move forward. And this round, rather than looking at congestion pricing merely as a revenue issue, the SFCTA and the Board of Supervisors are looking at mobility pricing as a way of advancing equity and fostering small business success. It is grossly inefficient that I charge somebody $3 for a 1.5 square feet of space on a crush-loaded 38 Geary bus to get from the Richmond to downtown, but it's free to take your giant, RV or whatever it is you want to drive down Geary Boulevard. The incentives are reversed. The fundamental limiting factor that we have for making mobility work in San Francisco is our streets are no longer getting any wider. We are not demolishing neighborhoods in order to widen highways anymore. So I need to manage my limited street right-of-way to maximize the flow of people. And if it takes up 10 times as much space to move somebody in a car than in a bus, I should be charging the car driver $15 of rent for 300 square feet of Geary and paying the, the 38 rider $5 to thank her for taking the bus and saving space in order to make it possible for that other person to be able to drive. It's simple geometry.
Simple. Congestion pricing, reform Prop 13, easy, done. One question that we at SPUR have been thinking about, and I think our friends at HAC have been too, is how do we find ways to build housing during a downturn? And so this is something that affordable housing, I think, has been somewhat counter-cyclical over time, because, we may have affordable housing money that is still sitting in the bank and can get staged out over time before it runs out. But market rate housing often falls off a cliff. And so curious if either of you have some creative thoughts on how we change that model in order to both from addressing our housing shortage perspective and from a workforce perspective. In the last recession, we saw a lot of change happen in that world, and would hope that it doesn't have those impacts again this time.
Yeah. I mean, I think we have to look at all types of housing, and where we're building housing. So, projects that we just entitled or passed in the hub may be difficult to finance during a recession, but an ADU in the Sunset may not, or may be less of an issue, or a 3-unit building in an area that was formerly zoned RH1 that we're able to now zone for a 4-plex may be more viable during these times. So we've got to look at kind of the broad range of the types of housing we're building. I mean, Vancouver refers to it as kind of the right supply of housing. It's different types of housing, not just what we're kind of building in the hub or even in Market Octavia, but these kind of smaller additions to housing. I mean, again, we'd like to come to a place where every home and apartment building has at least one ADU. I mean, we've seen success with ADUs. I think they're a little bit downturn proof. The state's made it easier to get them approved, and have we're at a point where we can do them ministerially. So, people we should see every home having an ADU. And 0.25 parking spaces in their garage, or perhaps even their garage converted to an additional ADU, but it's easy to do. It's relatively, less costly, obviously. So we've got to look at different types of units in different places in the city to build.
So at the SFMTA, I mean, there's 2 key things that we can do. One is look at our real estate assets and see which of them could be converted into housing, either to solve one of our biggest labor problems, which is that our workforce can't afford to live within a 70-mile radius of San Francisco. But the second thing is ongoing operating revenue. So if I can convert a capital asset into something that brings in an ongoing, stable, unencumbered operating revenue stream, that is gold for a public sector agency. But arguably the most important thing that we can do is to change San Franciscans' view of the relationship between transportation and housing. So just as the medical profession is responsible for cleaning up the failures of the transportation industry, the transportation industry is responsible for cleaning up the failures of housing policy. The local and regional lack of investment in housing is the primary cause of most of the region's transportation problems, and is the primary limitation that I have on being able to attract and retain talented workers. And that problem arises from a deep misunderstanding by the public, who, for example, it's very easy to think if you're driving in your car to work, it seems very logical that adding another traffic lane over there, like if I'm stuck in congestion, one more lane over there, like would allow me to drive freely again, and that would solve the congestion problem. It is clear, however, that once you widen the road, in fact, all you do is create land value at the end of the highway widening, which results in more sprawl out of the edge, which results in people looking for cheaper housing farther away. And all of that capacity is more than consumed within 6 months in an economy like the Bay Area. That widening highways actually worsens the traffic congestion problem. It seems completely illogical to a normal human, but the data is abundantly clear. We've spent billions and billions of dollars trying to solve congestion through highway widening, and not once in any city in the entire country have we succeeded. The only way to solve for congestion is either to destroy the regional economy. Detroit solved its congestion problem very successfully, or to use price rather than time to balance supply and demand. The same is true for housing policy, where like it seems like building a high-rise next door to me would create a horrible congestion and parking problem because I'm only thinking myopically about my individual block, not understanding that not building that housing next door to me means, it doesn't mean that the housing need goes away. It's that that housing need gets filled somewhere else. And oh, by the way, it's not like rich people are not going to move into my neighborhood. Rich people are kind of just like everyone else, except for they get first dibs. That's the nature of rich people. Building luxury housing doesn't result in like suddenly more rich people being created. It means that their market demand can be satisfied, not by taking your house, but by moving into the luxury condo next door. So these are things that are just really hard for normal people to understand, to think about the secondary and tertiary consequences of our decisions or our lack of action. Particularly in a city like San Francisco, where we so love whatever the city was when we first arrived here. And we want to hold on to that city as it was when we arrived. And if somehow, if we stopped physical change in the city, that we could also stop the economic and cultural change that is happening. It's completely untrue. In fact, everything that we do to try to freeze the city in amber is actually exacerbating the problems that we want to avoid. But it's really hard to explain that in ways that emotionally resonate with most residents. So, that's one of the challenges that we face as an agency, is just explaining the idea of secondary and tertiary consequences and training people to be systems thinkers rather than object thinkers.
We need Jeff to come testify during the Balboa Reservoir hearing this.
What year did you both move to San Francisco?
Permanently 1991.
Yeah, I did 1996. And I agree, it was perfect the day I moved here. Kind of gone downhill a little bit since, but it was.
That's right, my hair was so much better. If only like the city looked like it did in 1991, like my whole glamorous life, and including having forgotten about all the horrible misery, because all those memories are gone, right?
Right.
Just the pleasure.
I like that you brought up the transportation land use connection, which is something that, I think all of us learned about in planning school, but it's not something that the average people out there think about. And it brings up, I think, other uses that we need to plan for. So the changes in work that we're experiencing, shelter in place revealed or reminded us that telecommuting is a privilege. Jeff, I know you have some thoughts on this. I'd like to hear. So like, what is an equitable way of thinking about making that connection mean to you? And then also, retail is another sector that's heavily impacted by this crisis that the mayor talked about a bit. And I know, Rich, you guys are just at the beginning of this, but thinking about what do our neighborhood commercial districts, what's the future of those areas? And I'm just curious if you have some thoughts around how do we make that connection more robust, and how do you do it in an equitable way that meets people's needs for a range of people with different kinds of opportunities. A lot of thoughts packed in there.
You want to start, Jeff?
Well, Christy, what exactly, like, who do you want to start with?
Who do you want to go? Rich, why don't you talk about retail and neighborhood commercial corridors and commercial districts, and what you think the future of those areas might be?
I mean, certainly this crisis presents us with an opportunity about some of the things we've been thinking about retail and commercial corridor and how commercial corridors work and how we fill vacancies. I mean, I think it was one of those issues we were starting to look into, or had started to look into, and started to do some planning. And then the crisis came and really kind of changed how our retail corridors work. And we're going to see a ton of vacancies, and we're going to see businesses closing. In looking at the processes we had on the books and scratching our heads and saying, why do we have these? Like, why are we making it so difficult for small businesses to open? And why are we making it difficult to fill vacancies in retail corridors at a time, even pre-COVID, when it was difficult? We were having Amazon in technology have an impact on our retail corridors. So I think this crisis has given us the ability to kind of take a little bit of the blinders off and focus on really the core functions of our retail districts, not trying to micromanage what they look like and how they feel like and what types of businesses are in vacancies, in trying to get rid of some of the rules we have and the process we have to fill vacancies. So I think that's kind of immediate on the commercial corridor. I mean, even things like allowing office space or nonprofit office space, smaller type uses that maybe go against our desire to have active commercial corridors, but those should be the things that perhaps trigger a CU, not a restaurant or a bar or a limited restaurant or an arts use or an entertainment use. Those things should be as of right, and we should be able to process them in days, in weeks, not months, or have a hearing at the Planning Commission. So I think we have to tackle that head on. The broader discussion about retail, I think there's some interesting regional discussions and at the state level about retail, looking at kind of the big box, retail development that's happened, not necessarily in San Francisco, but regionally. And there's bills like SB 1385, which would allow for denser residential development to take place on these massive parcels where we have big box retail in parking. So I'm excited about that too. I don't think that's going to be enormously impactful to San Francisco. I mean, there's certainly areas of the city like Stonestown that can we can take a fresh look at. And do we really need, a giant mall with parking? But I think regionally, it's a great solution, and I'm excited to see that progress at the state level.
Okay, Jeff, I think what my question to you is maybe more focused on what we talked about earlier around telecommuting, not earlier today, but earlier before, around telecommuting and who's able to telecommute and what that means in your mind around transportation.
Well, yeah, it means a lot. I mean, it's changing everything that we're doing, including all of our assumptions about what services do we bring back first. So one thing that's clear is that, the people who are most likely to be able to telecommute are office professionals. So it's people largely with college degrees. It's disproportionately white and Asian, and disproportionately in the tall office buildings in downtown. A lot of those jobs will not come back for quite a while. And in some respects, that's really good for the mobility system because those jobs are super 9-to-5 peak oriented. Through COVID, we have seen very strong ridership patterns in our neighborhood commercial districts and to the big institutions, particularly the hospitals. Our ridership is largely people of color, like across the spectrum, largely what would be typically seen as working class or kind of secretarial class work, and work that is shift work happening like 24 hours. And so we're still seeing crowding on the 14, on the 8 and the 9 from Viz Valley and Portola District, through the Excelsior and Mission into downtown, definitely on the 38, serving the hospitals and the commercial corridors. And so there's actually a lot that's being written about how COVID is exposing in this really grim way all of the gross underlying inequities in society, from everything to exposure rate, like who is contracting and who's dying from COVID, and also who is being burdened the most by the shifts in work and in mobility, as well as schools being closed, right? So if you're, if you are, a working class family who had, kids in school, and suddenly now your kids are at home and daycare is shut, and like you're going to be fired from your job unless you show up, at whatever strange hour that is your assigned shift. Like how are you managing? And there's no support at all. So, the best we can do as mobility providers, our transit team came to me to try to shut down our OWL service, our service from 11 p.m. to 5 in the morning. And I was like, we can have that conversation as soon as you ride those lines and talk to the people who are taking the bus at 2 in the morning. And they did, and they came back to me and they said, yeah, we're going to keep all of the L service operating because that service is needed.
So on the housing side, I guess, Rich, it's clear that this has magnified the need for housing for low-income people and for people who don't have homes. Do you have any thoughts on how we can make some progress on this? Like, do you think that maybe both of you can answer this. Do you think that there are things changing in the public discourse around what we should be obligated to do to make sure that everyone has a place to shelter?
Yeah. I mean, I think we've got to have that serious discussion about how we fund affordable housing. I mean, it's a point I think the mayor alluded to it also. And it's obviously tough to have at a time when we're potentially entering a prolonged recession. But again, I think structurally how we fund affordable housing has to be changed. In this issue about where we build, I mean, you can look at the hearing we had on the hub, which is adjacent to, vulnerable populations and vulnerable communities in the Mission and Soma and Western Addition and the Tenderloin and Civic Center. In hear from residents who are concerned about gentrification and affordability, and then listen to the hearing we have on Balboa, where the issues are very different. It's about traffic, it's about transit, it's about neighborhood character, which tells me we're building not equitably. Also, we tend to build in District 6 and District 10 in areas of the city where neighborhoods are going through more rapid change in gentrification and less so in the western side of the city. So ultimately we've got to look, and we're starting the housing element, and that's going to be a major component of that. Again, there's state legislation moving forward that would change some of the exclusionary zoning policies we have on the west side to allow more housing on the west side of town. And I think that's critical to address these issues as well.
I'm seeing the interesting, I mean, it's still a relatively small realignment of San Francisco politics that, is the beginning of a generational shift that I think is fundamentally asking the question, is this a truly progressive city or merely a populist city? And I would argue, that's actually been a theme in San Francisco politics for a very long time, for decades. And it's at this intersection of housing and transportation policy that I think the battle is going to be fought. And it's going to be a really difficult one because there's a lot of individuals who perceive themselves to be truly and deeply progressive, who are in fact undermining their own cause by not understanding the true nature of how cities work and taking a comfortable populist stance that is in fact harming, that is pointing San Francisco away from the direction that they themselves want. But to bust through that, we who are technocrats have a lot of trust to rebuild. Like, there's no reason anyone should believe me just because I am the SFMTA director. We don't have a strong history of telling the truth to people and explaining complexity in terms that our residents can actually understand. We've got to step it up as leaders and build trust.
Both of your comments are a good segue into a question that I have, which is to go back 3 months or a little more. Both of you are fairly new to your roles, and presumably as you interviewed for the roles, you had an agenda for where you wanted to take your department. And I'm curious, what are your reflections on what you had in mind at that time for the changes you would have liked to make? Are some of those just totally irrelevant at this point? Are some of them things you still believe in, but they go on the back burner? Or what is it that you're accelerating and are, so much more relevant today?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, my number one goal and priority in wanting this job and hopefully in getting this job was about housing and in creating new opportunities for housing, new funding for affordable housing, working regionally, because I think that's key to solving some of our housing issues. And I think the mayor touched on this, like those are as relevant, if not more relevant now than they were the week I started, which was the week before the state shelter in place order. So I think those priorities haven't changed. Kind of where we build, how we should build, the types of units we should build haven't necessarily changed, building equitably across the city. So, other things I think have risen in importance, how we're going to work, the future of office. I think there's still going to be office and a need for office, but it may change a bit in kind of how people work and how much they travel into an office and how much they work at home. But I think the need for office space is still going to be critical. I think retail is probably a bigger issue now than clearly what it was when I started in addressing that is going to be a priority. But I think overall, housing is critical and will remain so.
So, I mean, it's so funny. I mean, I started in late December, which seems like 100 years ago now. It's like it's hard to remember, like, what was I thinking before COVID that consumed my entire life? And actually, it's relatively straightforward. So, the task of any transportation agency is to manage the public right-of-way for the public good, which requires defining what we mean about the public good. And that requires clarity about values. And so what I was trying to do is to basically realign all of our standard operating procedures and our way of doing business with, adopted policy, which we've had on the books for decades and have mostly ignored. So, our task was to decarbonize the transportation sector, which is more than half of San Francisco's CO2 emissions. Our task was to eliminate, the 40 people who die as a result of avoidable traffic violence every single year in San Francisco and reduce the 3,000 people who were severely injured. Our task was to foster small business success. Like we are a primary driver of the San Francisco economy. And our task was to advance equity. The transportation industry has done probably as much as the housing and real estate industry has historically done to destroy wealth of people of color. We're also the fastest mechanism for creating opportunity. And we have to make hard choices about where we invest. Are we going to invest in greater convenience for the privileged or in real opportunity for those with the least opportunity? And in order to do all of that, we needed a stable financial base that would allow us to deal with the many decades problem of deferred maintenance and underinvestment in systems, as well as overpromising and underdelivering. So in many ways, like our mission hasn't changed. It's just sort of realigned a little bit, where our immediate concern is the health and safety of our workforce, foremost, and our passengers. But to the extent that we're doing all those other things, COVID has simply exposed the urgency of getting our shit together and getting a lot more done a lot more quickly. And I think the way in which we, along with all the other city departments, have been operating over the last 2 months, have demonstrated what we can get done if we have clarity of purpose and a clear focus on the public good.
That's a great answer. I want to turn to questions from the audience in a moment, but just curious, what we've talked a lot about at the beginning about what is urbanism. We've talked about the details of what you guys are addressing now. Zooming back out to sort of urbanism writ large, what kinds of changes do you think see, not just San Francisco, but just sort of, globally or across the country from an urbanist perspective?
In mobility, there's this massive global trend that San Francisco is trying to catch up on to create a bike and micromobility network that serves everyone, from an 8-year-old kid with training wheels to, an older adult with 2 sacks of groceries. This is becoming an urgent necessity for us just to be able to accommodate the math of movement. And I'm actually glad that other cities are ahead of us. Like in San Francisco, we're not leading with the message, we're actually leading with infrastructure, which makes things actually a lot easier for those of us on the technocratic side. It's also putting a new focus on what transit is for. That it's not just for like moving the poor people, it's for moving everyone. And also, if transit doesn't work, neither does driving. That the only way to make it possible for people to drive when they need to drive is to make it safe and convenient for all the rest of them to be able to take transit. And so transportation is a single complex system where all the pieces need to work together. And in fact, that housing is inextricably linked to that the transportation system cannot function if we're exporting all of our housing demand somewhere else, because my view is more important than San Francisco's ability to continue to invite newcomers.
I mean, I'll just touch on a point we talked about earlier, is kind of how people work, I think there could be a shift in somewhat of a large shift in how people work. Again, I think that the modern office is not going to change significantly, but things downtown, restaurants, they rely on that strong level of density that we have downtown, people coming and going to work. And is that sustainable? long-term, or are we going to shift kind of and see office uses transform to more residential or other types of uses? I think that's kind of a big picture question going forward. You know, we've always talked about that as technology shifts in how people work. Will this speed that up or not? I think is still kind of an outstanding question.
Great, thank you. I'm going to read some questions that people submitted in advance. So the knowledge that our urban environment exists for families with children is much more prominent now that access to schools and childcare for our workforce has become such a prevalent topic in our recovery plans, as demonstrated by the child in my background. Do you think this knowledge will change how we do transportation, housing, and other urban planning in the future? From Amy.
Wait, will you start that? Sorry, I missed the first part of that question.
I think it's the knowledge that our urban environment, families with children are operating in this urban environment, and that there's a connection between, you know, access to schools and childcare, and that relates to the workforce. You know, we can't have a reopening plan for offices if we don't have a plan in tandem that addresses the need for childcare in schools. Yeah. So will this, you know, this has been heavy on the minds of many, and so will this change how we do planning?
Well, I think we've got to do a better job of planning for those kind of complete cities. I mean, we tend to focus on office, residential, retail, and it tends to, you know, institutional uses, service uses like schools, childcare, tend to kind of get on the back burner, especially when we're doing kind of neighborhood plans. You know, they tend to be a bit of an afterthought. I think we've made changes in progress in that regard, but I think this will heighten that and, you know, make us think about that even more.
Did you have a response, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, again, for any of you who've been out onto any of our slow streets, particularly on a weekend, but even, you know, midday and a weekday, our slow streets are being used by, you know, 2 to 10 times as many people. Like there's 2 to 10 times as much traffic on our slow streets as there was pre-COVID. It's just all that traffic happens to not be in cars. And depending on what time of day you go, more than half of that traffic can be children. It's so phenomenal to watch how beloved this, like, we threw out some sandwich boards and suddenly there's this massive new open space that is being loved by the community. It's requiring no management. It costs a couple $100. It's self-managing. And it is such a lifesaver to parents who are trapped in small apartments with antsy children. And children who are now not only being taught safe, you know, cycling skills or skateboarding skills, but children who are going to have an expectation that they could actually be able to get around the city. And anyone who comes out and sees this happening, it's just like, this is so fundamentally good. Like, of course, an 8-year-old girl should be able to get around safely. Like, an 8-year-old girl on a bicycle with, you know, handlebar fringes should be the design vehicle for streets in the city. Like, imagine how joyous that would be. And I don't have kids.
But it's joyous. I like that.
It is. I mean, we see people do it. I see people doing it in my neighborhood, just kind of taking their own initiative to close streets, which is great. And I mean, it speaks to some you know, the city's got to get out of the way of things and let things happen organically and not have too much angst about what's happening. I mean, I think for the shared spaces program to be successful, we're going to have to do that also. Like, allow communities to kind of manage some of this on their own without being overly burdensome and kind of the regulation of it.
So Lisa has a question. So what are the chances for slow streets to continue beyond the crisis time? They're so lovely and great for encouraging people to get around on bikes, etc.
So they're genuinely in pilot, like, and we're changing them around. Some of them are working, some of them are not. All of them need to be evaluated, and we will have to go through a formal process, including an environmental review, in order to have them be permanent. Because the old broken counterproductive regulations come back. Thank you, CEQA, post-COVID. So we have a long time to make a decision, but whether they become permanent, I think largely depends on their popularity and the data about how effective they're being in their goals of providing space for socially distant, exercise, and providing an alternative way of moving for essential trips, whether that's work trips or going to your neighborhood commercial district. So let your policymakers know what you think.
And we'll expedite the environmental review. It only takes 2 years. I'm curious to know where they're not working.
So some of them are working better than others. Like we're learning, they're better on flat blocks than steep blocks, particularly for kids being out. Like don't teach your 8-year-old how to skateboard on a hill. Yeah. They're working where there are strong neighborhood cohesion. They're better like self-managed. So there's probably some that we will change around. Like Excelsior Street may have not been the right street to choose in the Excelsior. Like maybe a perpendicular street that's more level would be better. But we'll want we are genuinely just trying stuff out because it costs us very little to move this around. So we're learning, and we'll move things that don't work and expand upon things that do.
One big extended pilot project. That's really cool.
Yeah.
So another question about shared streets, but from a different angle. Shaheen asks, how can SFMTA work with other city departments to adapt to shared streets faster, knowing that this can conflict with priorities for the fire department, for example?
Yeah, so that's been one of our struggles, is making sure that we're accommodating a whole array of goals, including the fire department's goals. And the fire department has a lot on their plate, as many city departments do. So we're advancing projects that are like easy, like of zero concern to the fire department, and slowing down streets where the fire department has concerns that would require a lot of engagement and sort of sorting things out with them, just for bandwidth. So I think a really good example of that is Holloway Street in the OMI, which was an early priority of ours. It's also a primary emergency response route. Holloway Street is also a street that will experience severe congestion, like definitely by August when schools reopen. So Slow Street may be a better solution for emergency response priority, but it would require more design on our part, more collaboration with fire departments. It's just going to take us a while to sort that out. But we're interested.
Here's a question from Scott. I'm a homeowner and have proposed a project to the city wherein I split my lot and added 4 units of housing, 2 affordable housing and 2 market rate. I'm 0.3 miles from the Castro Muni stop. Can you speak to the balance between adding affordable housing and granting variances on lot size and rear yard setbacks? I think, I don't quite follow. Do you, Rich?
I mean, not exactly, but we're now in the process of reviewing state legislation which passed, which would allow us to ministerially approve like ADUs in your backyard. So detached cottages that serve as ADUs. So we think that's great to use that space designed well to put in ADUs as well as put them in your home, underneath the first floor. So I'm not quite sure what they're doing.
I think the question is if they're providing a public benefit, like providing half affordable housing, which isn't required, Should there be some pathway to varying, making accommodations from a zoning perspective?
Sure. I mean, I think that's done all the time. The state has recognized this also. We recently had a project on Howard Street, which was 18 stories. It was a state density bonus that combined with SB 35 to be tremendously effective in allowing us to process that quickly. I mean, it took us 6 weeks, I think, from the time it was submitted to the time it was approved, which is somewhat unheard of in the planning world. So, I think the state is recognizing the importance of that in passing laws that would allow us to do these things ministerially. We should do the same locally, but that's the type of process change I think we'd like to see for every housing project that's code compliant. Obviously this is one that's somewhat unique, but we need to revamp our processes so that code compliant projects that are adding more housing sail through the process and our approvals are measured in days and weeks and not months.
So that's a good segue to Bert's question. How do you see the state density bonus and SB 35 impacting the region?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great. SB 35, you need to be a 50% or more affordable housing project in order to take advantage of SB 35, but we've already seen it working. So SB 35 coupled with state density bonus can be huge for getting projects approved and entitled and ultimately built. I think we need to expand that to be code compliant housing projects. Should get similar treatment in their processing. I mean, I think to some extent we bit off a lot at the state level, like SB 50 tried to take on a ton, both process improvements and expanding areas where we could build housing. The state seems to be taking on kind of more bite-sized efforts, but they're effective. I mean, they're incremental. We'd like to see bigger change happening quickly, but SB 35 and the state density bonus are two good examples.
Here's another regional question. This one's for Jeff from Nina. When it comes to active transport to alleviate the COVID card congestion anticipated the next couple of months, are you envisioning that working on a regional scale, or is that just a solution to relieve congestion on city corridors? Is there a way to make it regional?
So it is interesting, actually. So I mean, obviously at SFMTA, our authority is local, but COVID is forcing the regional transit operators to collaborate more than maybe we have before, in part because of the distribution of the CARES Act fund, the federal stimulus money that we're having to divvy up, and the very well-intentioned but with deep unintended negative consequences ideas around seamless Bay Area, the sort of integrated transit advocacy that has been happening at the state level and the local level. So the general managers are trying to get together in order to solve some other problems while we're at it. I don't think there's anything I can quite yet share, but we're hoping to be able to make some, maybe some pretty significant regional announcements in the coming months.
That's exciting. Question for Rich from Tony. Wanted to know what you think about current zoning laws. Currently, only 12% of San Francisco allows subsidized housing. While I believe in subsidized housing, I feel opening the city to more subsidized housing would enable nonprofits to build more. What are your thoughts?
Sure. I mean, obviously this is an issue of focus for us and priority for us. Most of the city is zoned for low density housing. To build affordable housing, you need 50 units plus in order to make that work. So, as part of our work on the housing element and the housing affordability strategy, we're looking at ways where we can expand opportunities to build that. And, I moved here 25 years ago, and I think the first thing I heard when I started working for the city was, we've got to upzone Geary, and do something to allow more density along Geary and some of our commercial corridors out to the west side of the city. it's still on our to-do list. You know, but it should be a priority. I think, again, the state is making it easier for us to do. I think the supervisors in those districts are recognizing the need to build additional housing in those districts, just providing more efficient transportation to those areas. So it's you know, it's something we have to do in order to take on our immense housing shortage.
Question for Jeff from Jeremy. Back to thinking about incentives and congestion pricing. Is there a future world where getting on Muni Rail or bus is faster, more reliable, and generally easier than getting your car? Thinking of dedicated lanes, priority signaling, etc.
Yes, yes, and yes.
Great, we can add.
Help us make it happen. We're ready.
Okay. I want to ask Jeff and Rich their thoughts about the removal of the remainder of the Central Freeway from Robin.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting idea. Certainly, you know, I was part of the team that implemented kind of the voters' vision to remove the Central Freeway north of Market Street. You know, it created opportunities for housing. We built over 50% affordable housing there, provided opportunities for additional recreation areas. So can that be taken farther south and east? I think so. I mean, the freeway definitely acts as a barrier along Division Street, and, you know, obviously would free up a ton of land to do more housing in open space. So I think it's an intriguing idea.
Certainly from a transportation perspective, the worst possible place to terminate the Central Freeway is at Market Street.
Yeah.
It is also the place where the third ballot measure to decide the fate of the Central Freeway, there was it wasn't even the wording, it was the little drawing that was included in the ballot that the city attorney interpreted, that the Central Freeway wasn't just going to have to terminate somewhere south of Market, but actually at the very southern edge of Market Street. Finally resolving the Central Freeway does require going back to the voters. And I think largely needs to be decided through a land use lens. So the Central Freeway is completely counterproductive from a transportation standpoint because of where it terminates. It exacerbates congestion by terminating the worst possible location. So its fate needs to be decided along with the fate of the Northeast Mission and the western edge of Soma, which are hard questions. Right now, the Central Subway, or the Central Freeway is, it's so horrible that it helps to drive down land values in order to preserve the production, distribution, and repair uses adjacent to it. Removing it, just like removing the northern part of the Central Freeway as well as the Embarcadero Freeway, increases land values. And so we have to be ready to have a conversation about capturing that increase in land value in order to deliver on a net public good and reduce the negative consequences of rising land values, right? I mean, this is the perpetual story of San Francisco. Yep. Is one of land value.
Yeah, and certainly that was an issue when the hub was kind of considered and approved by the Planning Commission. Yep. You know, the freeway acts as a barrier, kind of good and bad, but it can't be seen as kind of another force of gentrification in the neighborhoods that are adjacent to the freeway.
Yeah, that's right. But at the same time, like ugliness, dysfunction, and pollution can't be San Francisco's housing affordability strategy.
Yeah, exactly.
So speaking of sort of politics and the will, you know, what people in City Hall are feeling. A question from Christopher. This is the last audience question I'm going to give. There seems to be a unique spirit of openness to new ideas, experimentation, and getting out of the way of our city departments. But what is the half-life of this political windfall, and how do we maintain it after the next election cycle?
I mean, I think it's all about building trust, as I said before. We need to demonstrate that when government agencies are given the ability to act quickly, that we will be responsible, that we were responsible to the public, that will have deep clarity about the values, particularly as expressed in the adopted language of the Board of Supervisors, that we will uphold those values. And that we will address the really, really difficult trade-offs, the hard decisions that have to be made. We need to communicate clearly about those tough choices. I'm certainly going to have to make a lot of tough choices in the coming weeks because the government ain't a magical wish fulfillment machine. We have deeply limited resources, and we have to do the best we can allocating those limited resources for the highest possible good.
I agree.
Well, thank you guys. This has been really fun for me. And I'm going to turn it over to Todd to give the parting question.
Christy, don't go anywhere because you're including the question, just to be clear. So this was fascinating. The behind the scenes conversation amongst the Housing Action Coalition staff has really been really thought provoking, the things that you have said. So I really appreciate that. One of the things that we like to ask people is when we're having these town hall type discussions, what are you optimistic about? And Christy, we want to hear your thoughts also as to what you are optimistic about also. But we'll start with Rich. Rich, what are you optimistic about?
I mean, I'm optimistic. It kind of goes back to where we started this. I'm optimistic about the future of cities and urbanism. I mean, this has continued that optimism or strengthened that optimism. I think all of our ability to kind of embrace change and recognize that change will come whether we like it or not. I mean, I certainly wasn't excited to take on this job and do it from my dining room for 3 months, but I think we've all been very resilient in how we kind of adapt to a changing environment, and so perhaps embracing more change as we move forward.
Yeah, I would completely agree. In normal times, narcissism is San Francisco's dominant cultural characteristic. We are all very deeply self-involved. But when San Francisco faces a crisis, it responds to the call of duty. And I'm seeing that everywhere in city government, like in every department, at the Board of Supervisors, in community-based organizations. San Franciscans come together. There is a reason the Phoenix is on our city flag. We know how to come together and recover from a crisis and come out better than we were. So we need to continue keeping that in mind, to continue to remind ourselves that we are all in this together, and that in order to move forward, we have to move out of narcissism into a place of civility, to recognize we're all in this together, and to be kind to each other and patient, particularly as we deal with the emotional toll of the health crisis.
I would just echo what you both just said. Jeff's comments about us being social primates really rang true. My son, my second grader, just polled people for a math project to make graphs. What's your favorite animal? And nearly all the adults he asked said humans were their favorite animal. I feel like that is a good indicator, as well as our inability to stay away from each other, even though we're being told to, is, it's a hopeful sign in spite of the fact that we should follow instructions.
Yeah.
Great. And I just want to give all of you an opportunity to do final thoughts. If you want to include in those final thoughts, what can we as an urbanist organization ask our staff and our members to do to support the vision that all of you articulated today? So how about, we'll start with you, Jeff.
Don't let the Republican Party trap you into divisiveness. That only serves their objectives. In order to move forward, we have to understand who we perceive to be our political enemies right now. Understand the motivation of people who you think are on the other side. understand them deeply and with compassion and love. That's the only way we're going to get through this and beat the forces that are trying to rip this country apart.
So I mean, I think just continue to engage in honest conversation. I mean, I think having discussions where we agree or disagree and kind of robust policy debates is great, and we should continue to do that. I think it leads us down good paths and in good solutions.
Christy, do you have anything you would like to add? What would you like to see, or nothing? I don't want to see hack or Spurs numbers, anything more. All right, that's fine. Very good. Anyway, so I want to, again, thank the three of you. It was really a super interesting conversation. You know, and I want to say to people who are watching that we have videotaped this, we've recorded it, because I'm showing my age, videotaped it. We recorded it, and that we'll be posting it. We'll be posting it online, right? Exactly, so that people will be able to watch it again. Jeff, I have to say that you've really changed my wife's view of me as a farmers market populist. I'm going to have to like rephrase that point of view as you know, and think about that again. But I did think that really resonated with me, that question of like, are we a progressive city or are we a populist city? That's something that I am going to spend some time thinking about. And I think that's a really important question that we ask ourselves. And I think it's worth some public conversations around that. So thank you for posing that question. Christy, go enjoy your Manhattan. Thank you so much for your time tonight. Did an amazing job of moderating. Not surprised at all. Rich, let's get some housing built. What do you think?
Let's do it.
All
And
right,
I just wanted to plug, I know Jeff's got a big following on Twitter. I don't have a Twitter page, but I'm starting up a TikTok page. So I know housing Twitter is big, but housing TikTok is even going to be bigger.
I'm going to have my game.
That's right. Will there be any
future?
Will there be any comments on your TikTok? Just...
Yeah.
All right, everyone, have a great evening and the great rest of your week. And thanks again, everyone.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.